problematic, but he clearly has there's clearly idealism. I'm not what I don't mean because idealism connects with people. There's good idealism, it connects with people in maybe in a good way. There's bad idealism, it connects with people in a different way.
Hi, my name's Alan Cunningham. I'm an itinerant critical legal theorist and also a writer of somewhat more sort of emancipatory creative texts. My first book came out in 2013, Count from 0 to 100. Second book, Sovereign and Valid, followed 2018. I'm also a lecturer at the University of Manchester. My work there currently is more concerned with trying to place spatial epistemology within the context of legal doctrine, particularly, I suppose, property law, looking at that quite critically, very much influenced by critical legal theorists, critical theory generally. I'm interested in what forms of ownership are doing individually and collectively, because I think there's a real opportunity at the moment for kind of critical engagement with the ways in which people organize themselves. So, for example, looking at forms of government, within that, looking at the modes of organization that can happen economically, legally, whether it be something like property law or, for example, how some kind of distributive justice happens with regards to the finances of a country, the wealth. How do we distribute reward? And our project, I think, tries to explore this in a way that brings in the power of aesthetics and propaganda, I suppose, perhaps with a view to trying to show people, to try to illustrate to people practically how different ideas about how we can organize our coexistence can be useful, but also to try and place those into people's minds. You know, currently there seems to be a huge movement towards right-wing governments being very successful in propagandizing their values, whether those be this complicated idea of community, which, you know, often is utilized by the left, also even by the center. But at the moment, the right seems to have a real grasp on how that can be weaponized to create fear. And it seems quite rational. You know, we talk about community and trying to protect that. Most people would say, okay, that seems like a good idea. You only have to look at some of the presentations of the authoritarian Viktor Orban. But one of his main ideas, one of the main mantras within his thinking is this idea of community, family. That appeals to a lot of people. How do you challenge that in a way that doesn't undermine the importance of, for example, something like community, but doesn't then lead to this exclusionary, fearful form of organization, you know, where you're rejecting many things as a way of protecting something? How can we protect things by being open, by being expansive? So our group, which, you know, includes myself, who has some understanding of law, legal background, but also is concerned slightly more broadly with ideas generally, the critical approach to ideas, a critical approach to the psychoanalytic aspect of ideas. We have artists, we have curators. We've come together to try to practically and maybe theoretically as well, in terms of our discussions, present something that opens up these new avenues. We're interested in practical matters, such as, for example, things like pensions. We're interested in the notion of government. We are also interested in how virality, how technology has been used to weaponize ideology, to put forward, let's say, fictions about how we should best organize ourselves. Sometimes those fictions are useful, sometimes they're not. And one of the things that we've identified over the course of our discussions is a concern with care, this idea of care. Initially that emerged from our explorations of the law, where there's this notion of the duty of care that often governments have. It comes from their, it comes from tort law, which is concerned with trying to address wrongs. So there's this idea that there's a wrong, there's some duty that a government has, and they've been negligent in fulfilling that duty. They haven't done it properly. So the duty of care, which exists in very specific instances, we're perhaps slightly more interested in that as a broader concept. What is the essential duty of care of a government? What is the role of government, in a sense, you could ask? What are its values? And currently, that's that idea of government as being a caring institution, and I mean that quite seriously. I don't mean it in a facetious way. Is under threat, or it's provided to people only in certain conditions. If you do X or Y, so you have to fulfill something. Sometimes I feel like that can be problematic, because this idea of exclusion comes up. If you don't fit the criteria for the utopian vision, you're excluded. You don't get the benefits of care, and that creates further problems in society. So how do we reimagine what a government, what a community can be, that doesn't lead to this authoritarian, nationalistic, nativist idea that is open, that is not exclusionary, that is inclusionary? How do we create a vision of that type of government that appeals to the masses, that doesn't create fear? And that work brings in legal aspects, it brings in political philosophy, it brings in aesthetics, it brings in propaganda, it brings in the visual, brings in an understanding of human instincts, it brings in psychology, brings in technology. So our project is concerned with that. It's a difficult task, because during our discussions we've also realized, even within a collective as small as ourselves, there are disagreements about how best to organize something. But I think one of the things that we've settled on is this idea of a government or an organization, an institution that has a role of protecting and ensuring that people can live a life free from dramatic fear, free from dramatic harm. We see that as something that's worth maintaining, worth protecting, worth reimagining, and I think that's the focus of what we're trying to do with forms of ownership.
I'm Dana Slobodanka Stevcheska, visual artist based in Skopje. Since 2001, I work with Denis Raginovsky as a collaborative duo called OPA, or Obsessive Possessive Aggression. The work of OPA is context-based. It often involves parody, created reality, mockumentaries, tactical media, over-identification and subversive affirmation strategy, etc. OPA is not interested in developing its own artistic style. On the contrary, we frequently appropriate styles of both the creative industries and public media. We believe that being a political artist should not be limited only within the boundaries of the topic and narration, neither the discourse. We believe that the form and the tactics applied or used should also reflect politically. In this sense, speaking about our work, we cannot speak about production of artworks as products nor collectible items, but rather about development of a practice that is ephemeral in terms of non-material, or a statement, a trigger that would provoke an action which can be then disseminated widely. Relating this, we are interested into possible viral dimensions of this joint project that we develop together with forms of ownership. And its potential for both to attract attention to certain questions and to even open a possibility for a political or social action. What we are particularly interested in is the possibility to construct together with this multidisciplinary set of professions and minds a model and a strategy for an effective, applicable action. The initial idea of the project was established in 2019, and we started more intensive work on it in the beginning of 2020. But as the 2020 happenings advanced, there were constant joint reflections on it. Naturally, the project became even more challenging. In the beginning of the pandemic, seemed that solidarity on a global level could and would increase and will be awakened. But what we are witnessing now is the predatory behavior instead. Of course, 2020 crisis is only part of a larger crisis that already existed, the one that was already thematized and studied in the periods behind us. We have been speaking about different ends: the end of art as we know it, the end of art history, the end of history, end of museums, of art objects, etc. But will this kind of crisis teach us something else? Can we just reconsider the possibility that maybe we were talking about crisis from a comfortable, privileged position? While speaking about crisis and injustice, many of us run to pile a bunch of spaghetti and toilet paper. In the times of crisis, the first cuts are and have been in the cultural sector. It is happening and will happen with this one too. At some point, seems as if the art world is some kind of weird sect. Seems that this new normality born after the lockdown is fine without art, any form of art. In this sense, our debates with forms of ownership were about, yes, our project moves to and will happen in the real sphere, but in which way we are gonna do it? And what are the exact tools we want to use?
Hi, my name is Vian Chan. I'm an artist, and I've been spending the last 3 years or so thinking a lot about money and politics, taxation and so on. Yeah, I guess those are my main interests. So, looking at socio-political challenges, our EMAP project aims to challenge the government for failing its duty to care for its citizens. Legally, people have the duty of care towards each other, and when people fail to exercise this duty of care, they have been sued for negligence. And not only is the duty of care applicable between individuals, but public bodies, such as the police, also have a duty of care towards citizens. So when we look at care today, we see that it increasingly falls upon the individual. And by this care, I'm thinking of just more generally, for example, taking care of sick people or so on, or taking care of ourselves as we get old. So we see this duty of care falling on the individual, and that the public role is shrinking. So, for example, social services, public infrastructures are going through budget cuts. So citizens are either basically left to figure out their own thing, or they might be expected to pay out of their own pockets. And sometimes there is also an outright privatization of what was a public service. So what ends up happening is that not everyone can have equal access to what was or what should be a public service anymore. So, of course, care is quite difficult to define. So we started looking towards law for a legal definition. It seems it's quite difficult to give a positive definition of what care is. And it only really tends to arise when we notice that care is missing. So basically, this is what leads to acts of negligence. You can sort of see it as the inverse of care, which is the basis of many lawsuits. And our project argues that the government is guilty of negligence because it has been withdrawing its role as a public service provider. So examples will vary across country, but one example is the push towards private pension funds versus public ones through tax breaks and government subsidies. And you see this happening in a lot of places. And by pushing towards private pension funds instead of public funded ones, we're arguing the government is putting people's retirement and well-being in old age at risk in the private markets. So when you challenge the government or really anyone on failing to meet his or her or its duty of care and the failure to provide care, one of the things you have to show is that the damage done was foreseeable. So just taking the example of private pension funds, we can look at what these funds invest in and the rate of return. Typically these funds in private equity, stocks, real estate, and they also buy government bonds. And private equity and stocks are obviously not without risk, and private equity can even be very high risk. Real estate is a little bit less risky, but then it leads to increase in housing prices, which usually ends up being paid for by the citizen in the end. And with all these risks, the overall return from private pension funds is actually usually not much better than if they only bought government bonds instead. And if you only buy government bonds, you don't really need to pay into private pension funds with so many manager fees either. Also what's important here is that there's actually a lack of result from private pension funds, right? Because you see an increase in retirement age across the board, and this is actually a damage into citizens' well-being into old age. Now people are retiring. The retirement age is 65, and there's a lot of talk in various countries about even moving it towards 67, and this damage is foreseeable because that's the part about negligence and duty of care. because private pensions have been happening for a while now, and despite the lack of results, most governments are still pushing towards this direction through tax breaks and subsidies, as mentioned before. So then, one could say this is an act of negligence on the government's part. And then there is also this general argument towards privatization of pension and public service in general. And the general argument is that the government simply does not have enough money. So part of our work is to demonstrate that this is untrue. And with the current corona pandemic, this has actually been relatively easy. Because it has demonstrated that central banks, in conjunction with governments, do have the power to create new money. In Europe, the European Central Bank has a pandemic emergency purchase program, and that created, the important word is created, 750 billion euros to help member states fund their responses to the crisis. So that means governments can create money. It's not collected from our taxes at all. The money still needs to be allocated to meaningful resources and so on. There are more details, and we can get technical and argue about inflation, but largely speaking, inflation can be avoided as long as spending does not exceed resources available. But once we look at the state's unique power to create new money, money is no longer the zero-sum game. It's not this, money is not this object that's like, if I have it, then you can't have it. And consequently, that also means, in terms of causes, it's not can we fund health. If we fund healthcare, then we can't fund education, or then we can't fund retirement or refugees, which basically pits different causes against each other. With this perspective, it is now possible to fund all these causes because it's not dependent on taxation. So money is a system that refers to something for allocating resources. The system itself is not limited, even though the things it refers to are. And of course, it's actually really quite important that we have limited natural resources, but the world is also much more than natural resources. There's this thing, for lack of a better word, human capital. And this is things like care and creativity, right? We'll talk about, of course, the knowledge industry, but we're also interested in care and creativity. For example, the job of a teacher or the care we get from a nurse in hospital are actually less dependent on natural resources than on human existence. And these things are actually a really big part of our world and actually our economy.
I'm Boris Zuckerman. I live in Minneapolis, United States. I'm an artist, and I also a former engineer, and I am also a curator in the Weizmann Art Museum at present. And the way it all happened was that I was just always not satisfied with this idea that you can do something while you assume that it's separate from something else. You can do one thing here, you can do your discipline, or you can do your research, or you can do your art, or you can do curating for that matter. Somehow you can just imagine and actually act on that imagination that whatever you do and the results of that can be disconnected from the rest of the world. I think that idea is doing a lot of damage. The practice is doing a lot of damage. And this practice is very much rooted in the way our society has been structured, along the millennia, pretty much around exploiting certain things in some parts of the world while building our own lives in other parts of the world. We needed that intellectual scaffolding, we needed that imagination that something that happens somewhere else is separate from what happens here. That separation to us and them, that separation to then and now. And my work has evolved to basically try to understand how to deal with these separations as an artist. I tried doing it as an artist for a while, actually, but then I had this opportunity to take a curating job. It wasn't just a curating job, it was a job of creating a whole new program, and I believe also a whole new paradigm with it, of curating collaborations. How do you curate collaborations? How do you actually practically build a process where all these distinctions between people who do different things, they break down and people work with each other, or people work with across discipline, not just disciplinary, actually, across institutional divides, across cultural divides, across geographical divides, all these divides that actually don't allow us to consider the world as one coherent picture where everything is connected to everything else. And this particular project is extremely interesting to me, nonetheless, because of the difficulties that we face all the time. We are very different people with very different perspectives, with very different maybe goals, and we also see it in geographically very different places with very different political processes going on around us, so our context is very different. But the need to deal with the difficulty, the need to understand that yes, we're all different, we all have absolutely different ideas, but we need to resolve them, not just resolve them, we need to use those difficulties as materials, as our medium to make an effect in the world. We just acknowledge, we know, and we value that we're different. So what exactly do we do about that? What do we do with that material of difference?